Thank you very, very much, Baptiste, for the introduction. And please forgive my lack of video. I have to use my desktop, which doesn't have a built-in camera on account of my laptop being uncooperative. So I assure you this portrait is somewhat recent. I'm more unshaven and haggard as a result of marking. And I thank you all very much for being here during an exceedingly difficult year and a very, very difficult time of the semester. I'm just going to share the screen here. And as Baptiste mentioned, the file is has been distributed. So if you wanted to argue against various points and hold me accountable for any kind of discursive mischief, that's encouraged. And could I also just add on to Baptiste's acknowledgement of country by saying that there's some interesting things happening in this space to assist with decolonialism. Some businesses, for example, are getting in touch with their local peak bodies, if you like, for indigenous nations and are paying a nominal tax, voluntary tax. Some homeowners or people who live in different countries are also paying a tax to support the decolonialist efforts of the indigenous nations that they live in. And you may already know that there are some 7 separatist movements happening in this country where indigenous nations are trying to break free from a veneer that they see, and I agree with them in seeing as the illegitimate colonial power. So other talking points perhaps for a different day. Today, in about 15 or so minutes, I'd like to share a short essay that I've added to which was originally published by the ECPR, so the European Consortium for Political Research's latest contribution to the blogosphere. They call this The Loop. If you have short essays or things you're considering writing, I hope you send it to them. They're receptive and the editors are quite engaged. So there's a good amount of ping pong, which I really like to see. Right, so the headline for this, and I have tried to draw out the utopian emphasis of this, is that the more democracies, and I take it the phrasing here is going to be a little bit strange. It comes from a particular and rather old discourse in the study of democracy, so please bear with me if there's any turgidity or unfamiliarity here. So the main takeaway is that the more democracies that you find in a polity, and that's described as just a territorially bound entity, a city, a state, a village, whatever you like, that has people who ascribe to being members of it. So the more democracies you find in this, the better that polity will resist anti-democratic forces. So if we stop thinking about democracy, as many still do, as a singular concept that has one definite meaning to the exclusion of all others, which, as you'll see, I argue is something that never has existed, but rather think of this concept in the plural as democracies, and rather think about the degree of this variance, of the variety of ideas and their practices as may appear inside a polity. Well, if we think about it that way, I put it, then we can understand more about what can save us, if you like. And by us, I mean Democrats, those aspiring for further democratization, or if you're more in line with maybe Anne Applebaum and others of the center-right, the maintenance, the prolonged existence of the Western liberal democratic order, so heavily celebrated post-Reagan and Thatcher. Now, the utopian frame for all of this, I borrowed from my namesake. So I was raised a Catholic. Now I'm pantheistic, so I find everything sacred. Go figure. It's from Augustine of Hippo. And as you will recall from the City of God, De Civitate Dei, he employs this dualism. Yes, this is a sin in the different quarters of the social sciences, I know, but spare me the use of this. So he tells us that, we have 2 directions to go into. One is we can actually try to pursue life of and obviously he speaks to this more generally, but keeping it simple, he's talking about, an urban setting. So if we tried to take a city and try to bring it to the heights of humanity, then we need to reach for this through what he understood as the Christian ethics of his time. I'm not advocating for any of that. And he says the dystopian view of this, the other end, the other extreme of his dualism, is basically the status quo, the city of man, where we are not ruled, and I say man in an agendered sense, we are not ruled by ethics, we're not governed here by a higher calling, but rather, as many philosophers in the Middle Ages were known to say, we were ruled by our lesser, our animal instincts. And so what I wanted to do with this was to actually draw this out and apply it to this essay, to say that we can go after a utopian version, ideal, perhaps, of I'm not much of a Platonist, a direction, if we try to, let's say, create initially through conception, and that's what I offer here, and later through testing. I think we can test a number of these questions in situ in different, let's say, labs, and that this would be something that we could strive for. Less cryptically, I think we could be striving for a polity that has a very high degree of demo diversity. And this is a term that's given to us by a collection of scholars based in Portugal, some of them in the University of the Balearic Islands. It's not familiar to us in the Anglophone treatment of democracy studies. And it appears titularly in a book just published by Routledge, edited by Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Jose Mendez. So if you want to have a look in that, it's rich fare, and I think offers us a lot. Okay, well, we have a lot to get to, so I'll just go through the initial bits here. So how might we better understand this idea of democracy so that we can do more to defend it from current anti-democratic challenges? Well, as I've mentioned, the starting point is to adopt language from, say, Robert Dahl, one of the recognized, if you like, founding fathers of academic democracy studies. And in the preface to his book, I think it was in 1956, a book called The Preface to Democratic Theory, so in a preface to his preface, he writes that there is no such thing as democratic theory, there are only democratic theories. And this finds repetition in other books in the 1950s and early 1960s, where different scholars were trying to set out the field and tried, like my fellow countryman Henry Mayo, born in Newfoundland of all places, he tried to set out this all-encompassing view of what the theories of democracy are, and he writes that he tried to set them all out on a table, and he saw that this was a never-ending task, and so he threw it away and picked something more manageable to work with. And it turns out we tend to do this quite a lot. Anyway, Lenin also features here, who writes that democracy in general is something that you can never find in practice. If you go looking for democracy in general, it's never there. But if you're looking for a specific kind of democracy, then you can find it. The takeaway from Lenin is that without this type of well-grounded, perhaps common understanding of democracy, and I don't think such a thing is ever achievable. I don't think such a thing had ever been in existence, globally speaking anyway, that the word itself becomes prone to ideological mischief. And he participated in that, but he also saw various terms like pure democracy or true democracy as being a type of baby talk. And he writes this in two guises. The first is that, people who are ignorant of democracy's terminological variegation can unwittingly speak of it as if it means one thing. And then others do this and they talk across each other and sow confusion. The other and more nefarious guise is that you can take these trickster words like democracy and use them as a type of code, as a type of dog whistle, if you like, to advance different ideological programs. And, to any of you who are students of the Cold War, I think what I'm speaking of here is actually quite obvious. So we enter this period in the Cold War space where terminological war, this concept from Giovanni Sartori, became very apparent. So between the United States and the Soviet Union, we had both sides saying that they're practicing democracy, both sides saying that the other is illegitimate, and this has been referenced by historians as one of the key fault lines, if you like, of the struggle between those two powers, and something that could risk hotting up. But the one thing I wasn't able to point out in this essay, the editors were very good with their scalpel, was the history of this terminological war. It's much older than Sartori makes it out to be. And this quote from Tocqueville I actually pull from the first volume of Sartori's book, Democracy. And here you see the quote from 1835. It's our way of using the words democracy and democratic government that bring about the greatest confusion. Unless these words are clearly defined in their definition agreed upon, people will live on in an inextricable confusion of ideas, much to the advantage of demagogues and despots. Okay, that much is clear. Guizot, who was once Tocqueville's teacher, has a similar opinion that, in 1849, chaos means democracy. We can go through a whole variety of others. I won't mention them all, but I'll just pick some favorites. Here we have Albert J. Nock in 1939, who writes that there must be as many different kinds of democracy in this country as there are of Baptists, or even more. Press agencies must keep 500 assorted encomiums on democracy in standing type, like Western Union's canned messages for Mother's Day. Every time our first-string publicist opens his mouth, a democracy falls out. Every time he shuts it, he bites one in two that was trying to get out. I love this line from Bertrand de Jouvenel in 45. Discussions about democracy, arguments for or against it, are intellectually worthless because we do not know what we are talking about. And anyone from H.G. Wells to Julian Huxley to Henry Ford, it seems like everyone's got one of these lines, and this does go back centuries in this type of detail. Then we lose that finer grain when we go into the Middle Ages, as is expected, and we pick up arguably the earliest mention of democracy's variable nature and contestable spirit, which is in Aristotle's Politics. And he defines democracy about 7 different ways in that book alone. And he also states, this is you'll find this translated differently in various texts, but it's to the tune of, there are many kinds of democracy and they come from the things that people say. So obviously the actions orally that happen in assemblies, and that characterizes the types of laws that manifest. Anyhow, let's hop back to the mid-20th century and look at UNESCO. In 1949, they survey some 80 or so experts on the meaning of democracy to try to get some clarity over this terminological war. And it produced 3 still little known books. The first is Democracy in a World of Tensions by Richard McKeon. He was helped by Steen Rocken. Imagine that. Democracy, Ideology, and Objectivity by Arne Naess. This book is a goldmine. This is a gem. That the first edition, which I have from the University of Oslo, suffers from a lack of sufficient copy editing, but despite that very minor blemish, it does remarkable things. He actually provides some 350 different definitions of democracy across, I think, 6 languages. It's really a remarkable thing. If you're looking for the copy, by the way, at the ANU, I have that one, so I'll return it this week. And it is a rare book, I should note. There's only, I think, a handful of them in Australia. And then the last here is The Meaning of Democracy by Jens Christoffersen, which was one of Nace's PhD students. Now, these 3 books show us that there is this centuries deep empirical reality about democracy. It's very strange that people can still hold on to this idea that it may mean one thing. It hasn't ever, and if you try to go and look for those who claim to have the heart of democracy in their hand, well, there's a long line of them. So as per the definition of their category, there's not one, chief Platonist pointing to the chief ideal. There are many Platonists all pointing to different ideals, and it's an inescapable type of landscape. We have to face up to the fact that democracy means many things. It appears to us in many ways. So I won't spend too much time with Nace's points here. We can talk about those later if you like, but what I would like to point out is that he tells us in his 56th book about these complex designators, which Collier and Levitsky in their famous 1997 paper, Democracy with Adjectives, this is published by World Politics, they call them, well, just adjectival forms of democracy or subtypes of a general definition. And when you start looking for these in the English language, I've got a running list going, and there's more than 3,700 of them that appear in print. It's an astounding variety that keeps on growing. And so when you start to wonder what you can do with these, instead of talking about democracy in the singular, but necessarily talking about the democracies, well, that changes the way that we actually go and engage with at least empirical realities. We know that there's many out there, so what happens if we actually go and start to look at the study of democracies as opposed to the study of democracy? So Nace calls this a future science. He doesn't really tell us what that means. Christoffersen picks up on this and gives us a lead. He just says, if we want to understand how these democracies play out, what this future science is, then we've got to look at how they're used. So my colleague, Danica Floyce, and I, we wrote a paper now published in Political Geography, where we started doing that. We were asking ourselves spatially, where do the democracies happen? And one thing that came out of that work, which didn't really make it into the argument of that Paul Geo paper, is that we couldn't find a polity, big or small, that had fewer than 3 different types of democracy attributed to it. That was unexpected. So so far, I can't seem to find a polity that, and again, I would need to have some grant money to go and survey, villages and small islands and things to look for outliers to this incipient observational rule. But it looks like, the reality of our, how to put this differently, the reality of democracy, the reality of democratic nature in a polity is more on the plural side, tending more to the plural side than it is to, say, the singular. And that changes quite a bit, because it's different to say what the varieties of democracy index, which is the dominant one looking at, say, 5 or 6 different models of democracy. And they're starting to expand these tests at the subnational level, but they're pretty much stuck at the national. It's more than that. It's asking really about how many different types of democracy are observable conceptually and in practice from the ground up, from the members, the participants of a polity in question, and then trying to define the nature of democracy from that point of view. So it's much less a drop-in, expert-led, top-down definition of what exists and what doesn't, and therefore what correctives should come out of it. It's far more about what have you got going on? Can we introduce more to your polity? But I should keep going. So let's start wrapping up with this view of demo diversity and democratic quality. So if this is the norm, if our observation that polities tend towards the plural of democracies, then several different questions arise. First, and I think most significantly, is the question of whether polities that have a higher degree of what de Sousa Santos and Mendes termed demodiversity makes them better at resisting anti and non-democratic alternatives. And I wonder about this not just in formal institutional arrangements, but so too in cultural spaces, workplaces, families, clubs, arrangements in neighborhoods. I wonder about the number, and I also wonder about the quality. And as you can see further along, as we go down to these other questions, I'm also very curious about how they interact. So one of the questions that came from my friend and colleague at UC, John Dryzek, was about which models not only work together, but which actually contest each other. How do these sites of conflict, which is different to Sartori's terminological war, and has something more to do with this thing I'm terming the model wars, the struggle between models of democracy, does that produce for us some kind of a inherent good? And to end, I will just point out that the driving questions from this utopian frame, and it's this paragraph in particular, that if today is characterized by a nature of democracy and polities that is prone to anti or non-democratic alternatives, or that is preyable to them, or especially at the cultural level, we're told this by, many of you will know this, sociologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, organizational experts, that the culture that we live in, think of the ANU, think of the University of Canberra, think of your friends and colleagues at different universities. Are they governed democratically? Well, no. We have very strict hierarchies in many places, workplaces especially, that really put paid to our efforts at trying to do this lifestyle of being a Democrat, of being a democratically oriented citizen, and so forth. So that is the underlying question for us. If this turn in logics, which I hope has not been too wily, is accurate, what happens if we can maximize the number of democracies in a polity, the quality of those practices in a polity? Does this bring us to a type of utopia for democracies, for polities that wish to be democracies? Does it set us down some kind of an idealistic path, which all utopias arguably do, for further democratization? I think this offers us a chance, a logical, evidence-based, very deep history chance at driving a culture, a civilizational project this participates in that is beyond resuscitating the liberal democratic order, but that takes us into a different mean. Beyond that, I don't know. But it seems like we are in this dualism. It seems like my namesake, Augustine of Hippo, who I'm pretty sure was the only Black saint was helpful in disguise. And as you can see at the very bottom, there's some links, and one of them is to a philanthropic fund that the University of Canberra has put together. So please send all of your money. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.